broadcasting from Park Avenue in New York City. Brought to you by Global Wealth Office at Nest Seekers International and Classique Moderne. This is Peace and Good Wealth. Welcome back to Peace and Good Wealth. Today's guest is a German artist whose work exists at the intersection of painting, sculpture, material, and perception. He creates surfaces where light behaves like material, works that explore geology, atmosphere, digital image culture, and the changing way modern people experience reality itself. His works are held in private collections across Europe, the United States, and Asia, and his commissioned projects include works for Vacheron Constantin. Please welcome Ruben Benjamin. Welcome, Ruben.
Thanks for having me today. Great to be here.
It's certainly our pleasure. So, Ruben, let's talk a little bit about background. So, what part of Germany are you from?
I grew up in Stuttgart, but I live in Munich since 12 years or something, and it's a great place to be. It's a great home base. Munich, there's a lot of nature and a lot of culture, and also a big tech hub nowadays. So I really love being in Munich. Yeah, it's a great place.
How has Germany informed your artistic sensibilities, or where do you draw that? Where did you draw that from?
I never really thought about Germany itself shaping my practice, but now that you ask it, I feel like in Germany we like to do things very precisely, and that's what maybe also some people make kind of fun of, because it's like very, very precise and clean. And maybe this also involved my practice because I actually studied engineering, as a lot of Germans do, like mechanical engineering. Yes. And I didn't go to art school, but I've painted and explored since I was 10 or 12 and started working with spray paint super early. But maybe it was this mix of studying something very precise, technical, and then putting this creative energy and this technical understanding together. So maybe this was some kind of good mix of German technical culture shaping my work, I would say.
And let's talk about inspiration. Where do you draw your inspiration from in your art? So your art is at the intersection of sculpture and painting, right? So how did this evolve? Did you originally start like that, or did this sort of principle and philosophy develop over time?
I've developed this practice, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago, but during the time I worked artistically, I switched a lot. Like looking back, I think it feels like you always keep exploring until you find something that really feels right, and that's when I wanted to dig deeper. But I've also painted figuratively, and but I developed this practice I'm working in right now rather by accident, because when I studied and I didn't have a lot of budget, I just always overpainted my canvases. And by always building up new layers of acrylic paint, spray paint, lacquer, acrylic paint, like kind of a relief started to exist. And then something on a very small scale appeared, which I now call what you also pointed out, like this simulation of light, which is the topic all my work revolves around. And then I just try to dig deeper and kind of reinforce this idea. But it was kind of an accident that this happened in the first place, because I just layered and layered to basically save money instead of buying new canvases all the time. So it was kind of an exploration which ended as an accident, and then I found my signature style, which I now keep evolving and evolving. Yeah.
So, I have a theory that in terms of visual art, whether it's sculpture or, painting or photography for that matter, the reality is that it's really all about light, right? Where the shadows are. If you're painting or you're sketching, where you draw the shadows, and where you bring up, the light makes a big difference. And it really defines sort of like the work itself. It seems to me that what your work has basically discovered is sort of like to fuse that way of the way the sculptors would would bring out the light in a sculpture, and how light sort of like reflects in the, in the material itself, and how an artist like the masters would also draw and paint light simultaneously, and sort of like combining those two different disciplines into one thing. So let's start from the very beginning. At 10 years old, you're exploring art. What was the first sort of idea? What was the basic idea that sort of inspired you to go the artistic direction?
Oh, that's a really good question. I actually can't tell. I kind of feel like there always was a very strong creative energy, or rather the urge to get into this creative state. I think this is where most artists want to be, in this creative state where you give yourself the chance that something creative can develop. And it's exactly the same feeling when I do it nowadays, like when I was like 10 or 11 working with spray paint or textures. And I think that was always the main inspiration to get into this state, which I just loved. But over the years, more inspirations have come into this field. For example, nowadays I take a lot of ideas from nature and natural phenomena. For example, my latest series of sculptures, which I presented in Los Angeles, was a lot about erosion and marble, and exploring how light behaves on erosion and different stones. So these are some of my inspirations, but the core is always getting into this creative state and exploring how light behaves on different materials. And for example, now I'm working on a series with aluminum, and because I'm just really excited how the light works on this surface, and to explore it with my pigments and with a lot of pressure. And this is how I normally work. So I'm always curious to explore new materials, how light behaves with them, and then I also like to move on and explore new materials.
So when we talk about how light behaves, you're looking at both how light is reflected and absorbed.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of the process. For example, with the marble sculptures, it was really interesting because marble behaves different like many materials, because it kind of captures light a bit. You can kind of see it through a little bit, because it's slightly transparent, marble itself. And this was really interesting when I worked with these pieces, because they kind of shine from the inside a little bit, like the marble gets through the stone, through the crystalline structure. And with the aluminum, for example, now it's totally different, because it has such a sleek and shiny surface that the pigments which I work with, they behave totally different on these surfaces, obviously. And this is what I just like to explore, how they capture the pigments and how they react with them. And why I always say that the pigments behave like light is because I work with a lot of pressure, like super high compressed air with which I power my pigments on the surfaces, and this is why they kind of hit the surfaces like light itself, in very, very different angles, and this is how I achieve this effect. And so basically that's the technical aspect. And
so you're bombarding basically.
Kind of, it's endless layers, and it's often just super tricky. For example, with the aluminum, it took me almost a year now to figure out how I get like my super fine acrylic pigments to stick on flat aluminum, because it doesn't suck any pigments and water. And I had to work with so many different foundations, and with marble it was completely different. So it's a lot of exploration. I work very material heavy, very material based, but this is just what really excites me.
This is, I think what's interesting as I hear you talk about it, the engineering background and the sort of like the German outlook in life really just sort of like stands out to me, because you're looking at it in a very scientific way, right? In the way materials allow, light to either pass through it or reflect or absorb, light. And I assume also, because of that, the colors, the way the color is perceived by the person who's looking at it. And it also, I guess it's also very dependent on how it is presented, where it's placed, where the light is, etc. So so I could see that the scientific and sort of like engineering part of that. Now, let's talk about how the audience for the art perceives it. You know, what do they see? Describe to me, like after you've created something, what do you feel? How do you feel people receive it, and how does it connect, you know, to them?
It's always really interesting for me to see how the audience reacts to the artworks when they see them live, because you know I see them every day in my studio, and for me it's always a great process to work on my artworks. But I know how they work in space and in architecture. But it was, for example, now in Los Angeles, what was really interesting, because there were many collectors who had only seen the pieces online, and for example online, a lot of people think that the surfaces, for example, that they are shiny or glossy, because it could be a reflection, you know, for example, those monochromatic compositions of blue, for example. But when you see it live, it's totally different, because it's ultra matte, and like it isn't a reflection from like white or blues until indigo to black, but it's every pigment is painted and applied, and it's no reflection. And that's, for example, interesting that I often have the feeling that it's hard for me to capture the character online really well, because it seems like a reflection sometimes.
Well, it's also because it's lit differently. It's lit from behind versus from, you know, the light is hitting it from behind versus from the front, right? So, you know, and we always say this, you know, whenever we print something, you know, what looks good online doesn't necessarily look the same when it gets printed, because when it gets printed, the light is reflected on the paper versus it's being lit from behind. So so while probably online it captures certain details from behind, what it's not capturing is the surface, not only the texture but also the difference in pigmentation that you would see if you're looking at it in you know, in person. So that's do you feel that there are certain people that are much more attracted to digital art versus physical art?
Just one more thing I wanted to add to the last point, which I remember, which I always find really interesting, is that it's often the case that from a distance, a lot of often collectors or people who get to see my pieces from a distance, they often seem like a digital product or even a print, because it often seems like it's oversaturated, for example, due to the layering of pigment. But in contrast, if you get very close to the pieces, it's very interesting, because then you really see that every dot is a pigment you can see like a pixel in for example, in an image. So it's a very interesting shift from seeming digital from a distance, but when you get close up, it's more like a geological relief where you can see like every dot is applied on its own, which I find always very interesting to see how people approach it. And then once they get closer, they understand how it's technically done. And this is always exciting for me to see. That I just remembered this. Yeah.
What's interesting is it seems to me that it's almost the opposite of impressionism, right? You know, where you know, you have like scattered dots and you see all of the space, and then you know, as you get, you know, farther, you get the you know, you see the image, and yours is sort of like the different story. You look at it, you know, differently from afar, and as you go nearer and nearer it, you see the details of you know, of the art itself. So, you know, let's start, you know, from I think the creation of the art. You know, you have an empty canvas. How do you start? You know, different artists have different ways of sort of, you know, some people are more disciplined. They will just produce every day, and you know, and then you know, from that comes a sort of a body of work, and then there are people who sort of like look at, you know, have an inspiration, but everybody starts with an empty canvas, right?
Yeah.
Or an empty material, right? And that you mold into something. How do you get started? What tells you, Ruben, start working, and you know, how does that become sort of like, you know, how do you go from there to like the finished product?
Yeah. So, in the first place, I feel like it's just super important to really get into this creative state and the creative mood. And through the last years, I noticed, because you have to work on a lot of emails and have collector visits and this and that, and I really noticed it's not possible to get creative in a 4-hour slot or something. So that's why I'm now really disciplined in giving myself creative days, and the other days are more like those strategic days with appointments and emails and collectors appointments and stuff. So this is the first thing that I'm now really strict, where I say, like, these are my creative days where I allow myself to really get into this state, because it just takes some time and hours to get into this creative mood, which I like the most. Just plug my AirPods in, listen to music, and then just really think about what I want to work on today. And on some days, it's starting new pieces. So with the base layers, for example, where I really care all about the dynamics which I want to achieve. And in the beginning, my pieces all lay flat. They're all on wood nowadays, so no canvases at all on wood, on panel from my carpenter. And then I just, in the first step, I only think about the dynamics I'm interested in the moment. For example, for my last exhibition, I worked mostly with very big brooms which I screwed together to have like very, very big brushes and tools to really push those heavy liquids which I work with on the wood, and I build layers and layers. So this would be the first steps. But then I have different days where I, for example, just want to explore color compositions, and I work on very, very small pieces on wood, for example, like the size of a hand, where I just test pigments, because sometimes I just have days where I really want to dig deep in. For example, right now I'm really interested in brown compositions, umbra and brown and ivory, and then I want to explore in this area. And so it always shifts. Some days are more in building layers and going like really hard with massive amounts of liquids to build the base layers for artworks, which will then need to dry for around 8 weeks. So this is the first step, like drying for 6 to 8 weeks. And then there are the other days where I am in my different room in my studio, where I really paint with a lot of compressed air. And this is normally the last part for the big pieces, to layer endless layers of pigments until I achieve those super fine color compositions. And of course, if I'm working towards an exhibition, I have a strict timeline, because those pieces need to dry a lot, and I really need to get a plan how those artworks should be in dialogue with each other and so on. But I also love the days where I just really explore, and where I just say, okay, I just want to explore with this material or with these pigments I purchased, and I really just want to dig deep and find out what I found interesting. And I think these days where I just explore, and where I'm not working towards a crazy goal, are often the best days, because I think these are the days where you really find interesting things, like really interesting things where I then want to dig deeper. And I feel like these are often the days which lead towards new paths. And it's important to explore, because otherwise you always end up doing the same.
Right. What's interesting, as you're describing sort of your process, I it's not painting that I see in my head. You almost do approach it like someone who composes music, where you do one layer, sort of like focus on one layer first, and then put in another sort of like layer. So let's say rhythm first, and then sort of like the chords, and then the different instrumentation, and to create a piece, and and it's created in a way that's very disciplined, because you're putting different things sort of like together and making something that's bigger than just sort of like that one layer of things. So that's very methodical. I understand what you're saying about sort of like the business of the business end of of art, of making appointments and showing and doing all of those things. I myself find it very difficult to combine my creative mind with my business mind. They don't go together, and they're almost always in conflict. The artistic mind really takes a lot of time, and you really need to take, sometimes just one idea takes a whole day to sort of like just sort out, and it doesn't give room for the multiple things you need to do business-wise to try to finish everything. on the days where you say, and I think this is important for a lot of artists, especially the ones that are starting out, on the days where you're saying, I'm going to be creative today, this is my creation day, do you, do you have days where you say nothing's coming?
Yes. So I have days where I go downstairs in my studio and I start painting. And like 2 hours later, I come up and I'm annoyed and I tell my studio manager, okay, I'm stopping today. Today, nothing's working out. I mean, I think it's with everything in life. Sometimes you just feel on a day today it's not working out. It's not fun. I don't like it. I'm doing something else today. And I think that's totally honest to just admit. Sometimes you just don't feel it. The equipment isn't working right. You're annoyed. You're whatsoever. And these are the days where I stop after an hour, because I know these aren't the days where you make the best, where I make the best art.
Right.
It's and then I find something else what I want to do.
Well, some people, they say, and this is why I say that different artists sort of like approach it differently. Some artists would just do it even if they know it's not going to go anywhere, because it's just sort of like practice. I personally can't do that. I'll be very irritated if I have to do it, even though I know that nothing's coming out of it. But what about the reverse? Have you had days where you're supposed to be doing the business side of things, showing, etc., and then you get an inspiration that you really just want to stop and start creating? How do you manage that?
That's also a really good question. I have two good stories to tell here. Or first of all, to answer your question, yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes it's Friday evening, and then I started working on something and it's good, it's fun, and I really like it, and I'm really interested in it. And then it's sometimes hard to tell your friends, so I'm not coming out for beers. I really enjoy this right now and I'm in the flow. I like it. And I feel like you have to preserve this and take care of it once you're really interested in it. Or sometimes, as you said, when you should be doing the mail stuff, the business stuff, sometimes I see something in a different light, in a sun ray, or I find a pigment, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going downstairs now. I want to paint now, and I'm canceling lunch plans, for example. I think it's just really important that you give yourself the freedom to do that once you feel like it. But just a funny story I wanted to tell you. I remembered. I once had a studio in Italy for a month, like kind of a residency, and I was finishing 4 artworks there in Italy. And at one day, also my parents came by, and I was painting in the garden, and I was always swearing at some point, And my mother asked my girlfriend, is everything okay with Ruben? He's swearing all the time. And she was like, it's normal. He's just painting. And what I want to say here is, I feel like with every artwork I've done, it's always a fight at some point. Yeah. It's not always easy and fun. It's always a fight at some point, because things aren't always working out easily. Right.
Well, I think
it's fun, But it's a fight. It's exhausting at some point.
Well, I think that's really what makes, at least in my opinion, this is what makes an artist an artist. I feel that every time I speak to somebody who's very passionate about what they're doing, whether they're an artist, a sculptor, an actor, or a filmmaker, or a composer, the work itself can be very painful. Because you're looking for something. Sometimes it comes easy. You tap into what they say is they tap into an ether. The ether, and it sort of like flows smoothly, and it's wonderful, and it's great like that. But there are a lot more times where it isn't like that. It's not as easy as that. Or, you create something, and you take it a step further, and now in your mind you're thinking, now this is no good. It's just I kind of like overdid it, and there's nothing much more frustrating than that. So I think a lot of artists, because of their passion for the work of creating something that connects with other human beings, hopefully in whatever way, and also expressing themselves, that there's a little bit of a frustration, because art is not it's not a perfect language. Kind of there sometimes. As artists, I think the better you get, the more vocabulary you have for the art, and so the better you express yourself through the art. But do you believe that your work necessarily has a message, or do you have an intended message for your for the work that you do, or do you leave it up to the people who are collecting it, who are looking at it, to derive their own message from the work that you do?
So I would say my work, for example, doesn't have kind of a political or sociological message in that sense, but it just always revolves around the fascination for nature and physics and technology and natural phenomena. And I just feel like it's great to point towards excitement for these things in life and in the world. And for me, that's totally enough of a meaning to point towards this fascination and excitement for technology and nature and this symbiosis and this wonder itself. So this is what my work revolves around. And I feel very comfortable in this dialogue and this conversation. And for example, I personally just wouldn't feel comfortable doing political art, for example. This is just not what I want to do every day and be confronted with every day. And this is just my persona and what I find interesting. Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways, what you're really exploring is sort of like the childlikeness of every human being. When we're children, we're fascinated by the simplest things. We're fascinated by the soil. We're fascinated by the stars. We're fascinated by how the sun hits the water and how cool it looks. With very natural things, it fascinates us. And then at some point, as we grow up, it becomes more normal seeing those, and then we no longer see or stop and admire, how beautiful it is. And like in New York City, we don't see the buildings because we have it. And so we take that for granted. Nobody, any New Yorker, no New Yorker looks up to see what the buildings are. And I think you sort of like take that for granted. What you're doing is taking the natural elements in its very, very physical forms and sort of like reinterpreting it and saying, hey, remember how you were so fascinated with this as children, and sort of like to appreciate that again in a sort of like in a different type of way, which I would say, I guess, is you as a 10-year-old sort of like exploring. It feels like you've never, you've really taken that path of taking the simplest elements and putting them together in a way that could be seen as new again, and more and fascinating again.
Yeah, I think you really put it in a really, really good way, actually. I think that's a very good point. And also, I feel like curiosity is a very good word here, that I feel that it's just in every profession, I would say, but especially in arts, I feel it's super important to stay curious and open the eyes and look at the world around you, because I think this is where maybe in your industry you find the best opportunities, but also in arts, I think this is where you find great inspiration if you just open your eyes and be curious, as you said, as a child, like as you were as a child, because I think this is where you find endless inspiration and endless ideas if you just open the eyes again and look at all the small stuff going on around you in nature and nature, technology, and also society. There's so much going on all the time.
And I think that's what's fascinating about nature. No matter how good of an artist you are, at least in my belief, every once in a while when you look at nature, you realize like, I can't do better than that, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it gives you colors that we can't paint. It gives you light that we can't really mimic in some sort of, way. It just is almost, it's always, fascinating. I spoke earlier, when I said that light, we're talking about light and reflection and absorption, but also there is light that's reflected in the work, in things like the old master, portraits, etc. And you can see how life is reflected. But also there's art where life is absorbed, where it's sort of like part of our DNA. And I think working with nature sort of like reminds us that we are part of the same sort of like stardust, and that we are much more connected, to it than we realize. How has it changed now? How do you find it a challenge because we are, the generation, the newer generation now is much more accustomed to digital, and virtual images. Has it changed, or has it even been more important for people to see the physical because they're so inundated with the digital world?
That's a good question. I just feel like for example, the small smartphone thing, I feel like it can never capture the real character of a strong artwork, like just because of the physical size, and it can also never capture the a sunset, for example. I feel like it's worthless, like taking images of a sunset. It just can't capture the energy and the temperature and the pigments
And the mood.
and the mood. So I think it's often just underwhelming what you see on the phone, and that's why it's great that this week there are so many art fairs going on to see pieces live, for example, on the fairs which I wanted to see live for a long time, because it's just totally different. And I think the digital things, they all often ruin a lot as well, because it's just underwhelming compared to seeing things in real life. And of course, it changed how we perceive everything which is going on around us. I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, because it's also a great thing for many artists, for example, that you can get a bigger audience and you can get in touch with.
You're not reliant on every gallery to show your art. You could literally offer it to the world and be seen by many people.
For example, this is a point, but also getting in contact with many great people here in the city, for example, with social media is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And these are things I really like. But for example, from the visual aspect, I feel it's often underwhelming to rate art on your smartphone until you have seen things live. This is often how I feel. For example, last year at Art Basel, there were things which I loved online. I didn't like them seeing them live, but also vice versa a lot. That things which I found mediocre, seeing them on Instagram were incredible live. So I think it's good to go out and go to artist studios, just write artists on Instagram or on their website if you can see their art at the studios live, or on art fairs or galleries, because it just changes to see the thing live.
Well, I think that there's also, I think that's a very important thing, to bring up. Whenever we photograph something, an image, the lens sees something else, right? There's something about our eyes and our ability to feel the atmosphere. When you're seeing something that's very, I would call it very romantic, right? Like these buildings behind me are not as near as the camera would see it as we would. We would see it nearer because the focus of our eyes and our brain are the things that sort of like stand out, the beautiful things, etc. And so, sometimes the camera captures exactly what it is in terms of the physical world, but it doesn't capture the spirit of what it is when you see it in person. And I think that sort of like feeling of that connection, or fascination or curiosity or any of that stuff that makes us really enjoy not just the art of seeing something, but the process of creating something is something that a camera can't capture. That's why photographers, very good photographers, I think, we admire them, because they capture that sort of like spirituality and romance that the lens wouldn't otherwise, if they didn't have somebody actually taking that time to make sure that the light is just right, the shadows are right, the composition is right, etc. I think that's where sort of like the art comes in. So what's next for you, Ruben?
So I'm here for the next 3 weeks in New York City, mainly to meet a lot of collectors, art advisors, art dealers, go to the art fairs, and also meet a lot of friends here in the city. And this is just also a time for me to work on new concepts and ideas for the second half of the year. So I'm just really enjoying the next weeks here and try to meet a lot of people. And after this, I just really want to spend a lot of time in the studio again, because now March, April, and May were a lot of traveling, having the big exhibition in the south of Los Angeles and spending a lot of time in the US in general. And I'm also just looking forward to spend a lot of time in my studio in Munich afterwards to work on just a new body of work, to explore further works on aluminum, and I'm really making good progress here, and also to work on some new sculptures, like three-dimensional sculptures, which I'm working on right now, which will be made out of black sand. It's a very interesting material. And so these are some things I'm working on right now. And I'm just really hyped to get back into the studio and just to start working on the artworks again, because also in April it was always back and forth between the studio and going to Paris, going to Zurich. And as I said, when I'm just in the studio for 2 or 3 days, it's just really hard for me to really get into this productive, creative state.
Right.
And I love those weeks where I have almost no appointments and I can just really leave my MacBook shut and just go downstairs and paint. These are my favorite weeks, and I want those in June and July a lot.
So a couple of quick things. Having worked with multiple different types of materials, are there materials that, what are materials you really love and what are materials you don't particularly like working with?
Okay, that's a good question. For example, I really hated aluminum in the beginning, or metals, because it's just super hard to get the pigments sticking on them the way I wanted it. But I really wanted to work on these very thin, elegant surfaces, like those almost architectural surfaces. And for example, this black sand I'm talking about, which is going to be 3D printed, is a material which I loved from the beginning because it has such a nice texture itself. It's very grainy, and through this graininess, it has a lot of depth. Like the pigments, they have so much depth on the material itself.
Is it black sand like volcanic type sand?
No, it's just basic, very fine sand, which has black pigments and some kind of binder, which makes it glued together in the 3D printing process.
I see.
And it's a great material, but I just love the surface and the way the pigments stick on it. But besides this, I mean, I've been exploring wood recently, but the thing with wood is that it kind of erodes over the years, and would have to be like super solid for it to be like really collector and gallery ready, and to not erode over a couple of years and things like this, where I always approach it from kind of also engineering perspective. So is this good to mount it on a wall, or will this erode over the years?
Right.
And this also has to be 100% perfect.
So aside from your work, what other art do you like? And number 2, outside of art, what else do you like?
Outside of art.
Outside of art.
Outside of visual art.
Outside of visual art. What else do you like to do or see?
I mean, obviously music, and I think it's interesting because you pointed it out that music has a lot of freedom by producing music, because I also was producing some electronic music in the past, or let's say electronic and cinematic kind of mix.
So like layering.
Yeah.
And
what I also found really frustrating in this process is that you have endless opportunities and endless options, which kind of chord progression you start with, which kind of melodies, which kind of bass line, which kind of percussion, which kind of echoes or reverbs. And there are so many options that I found it fun and I want to pick it up again, but I also found it frustrating because it's kind of a whole universe to explore, and you have to decide all the time, okay, what do I really want to do?
Right.
And
in a very short period of time also, in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And when you're on, it's great. When you're off, it feels tedious because there's so many things going on at the same time, and so many, as you said, so many options. It's, music is like, it's math, right? So there's so many different types of formula that can create a certain product. It's great when it works, and it's not so great when it doesn't. Is there a particular artist or sculptor that you feel you kind of look up to, whether it's because of how their career or the way they approach art, that that you would like to aspire to be closer in terms of the way they approach art?
Oh, let's think. There are so many. I love, for example, Anish Kapoor and his objects who work architectonically. I love German artist Katharina Grosse, who works also like very rough with a lot of pressure and pigments, and it's like monumental paintings and how she built her career. But I also like artists, for example, like Daniel Arsham, who has built his own universe about the topic of erosion, and how he is incredibly independent, but also works with some of the best galleries in the world, and how he built his own universe. So I feel like there are many different ecosystems, from artists who are very traditionally and very academic, and also artists who break out of this ecosystem and build their own universe. And from each of these topics, there are artists which I really like, or also C.J. Henry from New York City, who also doesn't work with galleries at all, and has built an incredible brand and is doing just great art, super successful, super fun. And that's what I also like about this ecosystem, that there are so many branches, and I wouldn't say there is a right or wrong way to do things. You just have to figure out what's best for you, and to try to focus on doing the best art you can do. And what this is, I think this is just the thing you can decide. And I think you shouldn't let others decide, because I think this is where it's getting fugazi is when everybody is telling you what you should do or what you shouldn't do.
So your substance gets watered down because of so many input from different people. And so from your point of view, for Ruben Benjamin, when we hear your name, what would you like us to, what's kind of impression that you would like us to have?
That's a really good question, actually, and I think that's. I never really thought about this a lot, but I think I would be happy if the first thing comes to mind is this idea of this simulating light, or these pieces which seem kind of illuminated, and be it on sculptures or on very thick textures or on wood or on marble. Shouldn't even be important. It's about the main idea which all my pieces revolve around. And I think this would be the core, like the simulation of light on, or turning light into material. I think that would be it, to be honest. But I never really thought about this a lot.
So seeing, having people have, their own sort of perspective on the object that's created, because light is really about perspective, right? So people see things differently based on the light, based on their ability to see colors, their ability to also be not only to connect, but their ability to be affected by what they see. I mean, that experience is all different, from everybody, even though it's the same materials and it's the same art that they're looking at. People would have different experiences, and I think that's a very fascinating challenge to have, because it's coming from something very basic like nature, and to capture sort of like nature in a piece of in an art object. I think it's very aspirational. It's a big challenge that not many people, I think, are I think most people, there are a lot of people who produce quote unquote art that's very obvious. That's easy. That's very commercial and easy to sort of understand and accept and appreciate. But there are your art, I think, is something much more deeper and much more. What's the word I want to use? Substantial. From the deepest level.
And I personally think that the cleanest ideas are often also the best ideas. I think you shouldn't overcomplicate things. And I personally feel that often artists get a bit lost when they try to put too many ideas into one artwork. You know what I mean?
Right, yes.
And I think the artwork doesn't get better when you put more and more ideas and techniques into one piece, and you want to put this and that on top.
People get confused.
Exactly. And also with the parallel of music, I think the best pieces are often 3 layers, guitar, drums, and a singer can be perfect. You don't need more. You just have to execute a very fine idea perfectly. And I think this is also how you can stay remembered, when you have a very clear idea, very well executed, and you don't put extra levels on top of it to kind of make it better, but you just distort it and
it's what makes the impression, right?
Exactly.
The simplicity.
Exactly.
The simplest. I think the best food that we've had are the simplest recipes. It connects with everybody, but also whether it's art or writing, editing is the most important thing. Getting rid of, you have all of these ideas, but you have to have one coherent, idea, and you could multiply that with different works, but it can't be all in one thing. And I think that's what happens. Well, thank you so much, Ruben, for being with us. And I think, what makes great artists important is not simply that they create the objects, but they also discover new ways of seeing things, which you certainly are helping us do with your work. And perhaps more importantly, it's sort of like a new way of reconnecting, not just with ourselves and with each other, but also with nature that's sort of like all around us, which, so somewhere along the line we forget as we get older. Thanks again, Ruben. And on behalf of Global Wealth at the Seekers and Classique Moderne, this is Loy Carlos wishing you peace and good wealth.